Atomic Habits workshop. I'm Kirsten Philpott. I'm one of the Healthy Lifestyles educators. Lucky for you, I get to present in our closet of an office, so you all get to see what our office looks like in the background. But I'm excited that everyone is here today. We have a lot of really fun things that we get to discuss. Is it recording? Yeah, it's recording. Okay, just double checking that we are recording. Brittany is going to throw our sign in the chat. So please make sure that you guys sign in so you can get points for this. And we will go ahead and get started. So first off, who has read this book? Can we get a raise of hands who's read the book, or throw it in the chat if you have? And if you have not, no worries. Okay, it looks like we have a few people that have, and some people that have not, and that's totally a-okay. So the purpose of the Atomic Habits book is exactly the title of it. So it's an easy way and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. And so over the next 2 weeks, so we have a workshop today, and then we have another workshop next Tuesday. We're going to cover a lot of the topics from the book. And we'll talk about the 4 different laws of behavior change that the author brings up. But the first thing is I want to set some expectations for this workshop, because we're going to do it a little bit different than we have in the past. So for this workshop, I'm going to need and want a lot of participation from you guys. So if you're willing to flip on your cameras, that would be great. If you're willing to unmute yourself when we ask questions, I would love that. If not, please participate in the chat, or just have some active listening. And I want you to be able to get a lot out of this. Like I said, we're going to cover a lot of concepts, but because of the nature of this workshop, instead of waiting to ask your questions at the end of our workshop, I would love for you to interrupt me. So if you have thoughts, if you have ideas about the things that we're discussing, please interrupt me. Ask your questions, share what's worked for you or what hasn't worked for you, because that's how we're going to learn the best. So without much ado, can someone read the definition for atomic that you see on the screen? Does someone mind unmuting themselves and reading that?
Atomic, an extremely small amount of a thing, the single irreducible unit of a larger system, to the source of immense energy or power.
Perfect. Thank you. So the most important part when we're talking about this book specifically, but when we talk about building habits, is that instead of trying to conquer what seems unconquerable, instead of trying to reach for a really big goal, the point is to just find something small and simple that we can make an easy change for. So we want to look at the atomic level. Does someone mind reading the habits definition?
I can read it. A routine or practice performed regularly, an automatic response to a specific situation.
Thank you. So a habit is something that we naturally just do, and it's because of years of practice and just automatic behavior. And so when we're trying to break a habit, that can be really difficult. So we're going to talk about ways we can make good habits, as well as ways that we can break some of our bad habits. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to watch this video. The voice you hear behind this video is James Clear. He's the author of Atomic Habits, and he is going to talk about this concept of marginal gains.
Let me tell you a story. So it's a story about a strategy, an approach, philosophy, one that I've been thinking a lot about. And it starts with a guy that maybe you haven't heard of. His name's Dave Brailsford. And to set the stage for this, I want to tell you a little bit about British cycling. So about 15 years ago, early 2000s, British cycling hires this guy named Dave Brailsford. And at that point, for the last 100 years, British cycling had been incredibly mediocre. They had won a single gold medal back in 1908. They had never won a Tour de France, which is the premium race in cycling, the premier race. And so they hired this guy named Dave Brailsford to change that. And in fact, at the time, they were so mediocre that when they went to buy a new set of bikes, they're going to get like 200 from a top manufacturer in Europe. They actually weren't even given quotes from the manufacturer because they didn't want other teams to see the British riders using their gear for fear that it would hurt sales. And so they brought Brailsford in, and they said, "What's your plan for changing this?" And he said, "Well, I believe in this philosophy that I call the aggregation of marginal gains." The way that he described it is the 1% improvement in nearly everything that you do. So they started with a bunch of things that you would expect a cycling team to start with. So for example, they put slightly lighter tires on the bike. They got a more ergonomic seat for the riders to sit on. They had their outdoor riders wear indoor racing suits because they were lighter and more aerodynamic. They had each rider wear a biofeedback sensor so they could see how they would respond to training and then adjust it appropriately for the person. But then they did a bunch of things you wouldn't expect a cycling team to do. So they split tested different types of massage gels to see which one led to the best type of muscle recovery. They taught each rider how to wash their hands to reduce the risk of infections. They wouldn't get a cold after, get sick. They also figured out the type of pillow that led to the best night's sleep for each rider and then brought that on the road with them to hotels whenever they were competing. And Brailsford said, if we can actually do this, right, if we can execute all these little 1% improvements, then I think we can win a Tour de France within 5 years. He ended up being wrong. They won it in 2 years, and then they repeated again the third year with a different rider. And then after a 1 year break, they won 2 more. So they've won 4 out of the last 5 now, have gone to British cyclists. But it was at the Olympics in London in 2012 when this kind of strategy really came to fruition. They won 70% of the gold medals available. And so this idea that small improvements, tiny habits, little choices are not just a cherry on top of our performance, not just like a nice thing to have, but actually can be the key that unlocks significant success. That's an idea that I want us to carry with us as we go through the rest of this presentation. And one way to think about it is just kind of basic math. Like if you just look at the numbers, if you were able to improve by 1% each day for an entire year, and those gains compound, you would end up 37 times better at the end of the year. And if you were to get 1% worse, you would whittle yourself almost all the way down to 0. And what's interesting here is that everybody wants a transformation, right? Everybody wants a radical improvement, want rapid success. But we fail to realize that small habits and little choices are transforming us every day already. That these times when you make a choice that's slightly better, slightly worse, a little mistake or a small error, 1% better or 1% worse, that these things compound over time.
Okay. What did you guys think of that video? Any thoughts? You can either unmute or throw yourself in the comment in the chat box.
So, it was both inspiring and depressing. The thought that a little bit over time you can do, but then every little bad choice that you make just compounds as equally as every good choice. So that part was a bit depressing.
Small of such change, such as like the pillow or the small tiny habit or whatever you may think is, oh, that's not going to make a difference today. But if you look at how long you'll be doing that and how big that change can amount to, I think that that is crazy to think about.
Yeah, it's really such just a small thing that can make a big difference. Maureen says it's a reminder of a reality that it's our everyday actions are what defines us rather than the big things we work on. Sean says, sounds like little improvements over time can make a big positive change. Candy, every little bit counts. And Corey says, inspiring, that I can make a small change to make a big difference over time. Sometimes making changes can be overwhelming. And I totally agree. And that's what we're talking about here on this next slide. So I want us to throw out the thing that we almost always talk about, which is goals. Goals are great. I'm not taking away from the importance of goals, but sometimes we focus so much on goals that we forget about the systems. And systems are what, especially the author of Atomic Habits, really focuses on. So one of the first things he says in the books is that goals are the result you want to achieve. Systems are about the processes that lead to those results. And so he goes on to say, and make the observation that winners and losers, they have the exact same goal, right? Think of your favorite, it's football season, so think of your favorite college football team or NFL team. No one's going in trying to not win the Super Bowl, right? Or not win the Big Ten. Their goal is to win. However, someone loses. And so when we change our system, when we make those 1% differences, that's really what makes the difference. So can anyone think of an example of a goal versus a system? Specific example. And I can give you an example. So going alongside the sports analogy. So a goal would be to win a championship. The system in which to achieve that goal would be how you recruit the players or how you manage the assistant coaches. It can also be the way that you conduct practices, right? How many times a day are you practicing? What times of day are you practicing? So that's the system in which you can achieve your goal. Another example, for example, with healthy lifestyles. So one of our goals is to see an improvement on lactation rooms and that implementation across county facilities. The system that we have in place to help with our goal is to help educate on rights, to work with facilities and with HR to create education products for parents and expecting parents. And so when we are creating goals, what we really need to be focusing on is the systems. So I just want to look at the chat real quick and see what else we have here. So Sean says climb a hill. Kimberly says a goal would be to lose weight. The system would be the actions you take. So kinds of food, increasing in exercises. That's great. That's a great example of a system. Lisa also says if your goal is to lose weight, the system would be the steps that you use to do it. Conscious eating. Yes, all of those things would help with the losing weight goal. Another one that Lauren says is a goal would be trying to get a promotion in a job. The system is doing the legwork to make you more eligible for the position, right? So professional improvement. What are you doing to help pad your resume? What experiences are you gaining? Those are your systems. Does anyone mind reading the quote on the very right of the page under "It's not you"?
I'll read it. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're having trouble changing your habits, the problem
If you're having trouble changing your habits, the problem isn't you. The problem is your system. Bad habits repeat themselves again and again, not because you don't want to change, but because you have the wrong system for change. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You do not fall to the level of your system. Oh, I'm sorry. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems.
Thanks, Brittany. I love that quote. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So when we're talking about the problems with goals, it's that first one, right? Winners and losers have the same goal. The second problem is achieving goal is only a momentary change. We need to think to change our results. Hence why we set and complete goals. However, the real problem is not the result, it's the system that causes the result. So when we change or achieve a goal without fundamentally changing our system, we're just creating a momentary change, right? Because yes, we achieved that goal, but what's going to stop us from falling back into patterns? The third problem with goals is that goals can restrict our happiness. So think about whatever that goal that you've had in mind for the past year. Maybe that goal you set at the beginning of the year that you were sure you were going to achieve. And maybe you did, maybe you haven't yet. But when we set a goal and we're so focused on achieving our goal, we limit our ability to feel happy and satisfied with ourselves until the goal is achieved. However, one of the quotes from the book is, when you fall in love with the process rather than the product, you don't have to wait to give yourself permission to be happy. You can be satisfied anytime your system is running. And a system can be successful in many different forms, not just the one you first envisioned. So when we are focused on changing tiny 1% things, right, rather than achieving this big overarching goal, we can be happy with the process of achieving that goal. And then the fourth one is that goals are at odds with long-term progress. Habits are not about any one goal, rather it's about committing ourselves to a process of refinement and continuous improvement. It's about focusing on that 1% so that you're always changing instead of riding the small high that comes with accomplishing a goal and then falling back into old ways. We want to try and throw out that yo-yo effect and instead build true lifelong behavior change. And that's what Atomic Habits is all about. It's about building lifelong behavior change rather than achieving one goal only to fall back into old patterns. So the real reason habits matter is not because they can get you a better result, although they can do that, but because they can change your beliefs about yourself. So there's three things when it comes to setting a habit. One, you have your outcome change, right? This is what you get. The second one is your process change. This is what you do. And then ultimately, when you create a habit, you create an identity change. And this is what you believe. So for outcome change, right, we're only concerned with the results. The example would be winning a race, right? Or maybe it's performing a piano piece or getting a promotion. So when we're only focused on the outcome, that's all that matters is, did we hit that goal? The second process would be that process change, right? So that's concerned with what we talked about on the last slides. It focuses on our habits and our systems. It focuses on changing your running schedule, right? So that you can complete that marathon, or looking at how often you practice piano so that you can master that new piano piece, or your development of a new work product so that you can get that promotion. But it's this third level, this identity change, that really affects what we can do, right? Because when we change our identity, when we change who we intrinsically believe we are, we have the ability to simply act. So level 3 changes our beliefs, our worldviews, our self-images. It also shapes how we judge ourselves as well as how we judge others. So the goal is to build an identity based on habits instead of focusing on what we want to achieve. Instead, we're going to try and focus on who we want to become. And so that's really the purpose of this whole workshop, is learning how we can change our intrinsic identity so that we believe we are the person that has the goals we want to develop. For example, he says, your behaviors are usually a reflection of your identity. What you do is an indication of the type of person you believe that you are, either consciously or non-consciously. So I want you all to take a minute, close your eyes, and identify an internal mantra that you commonly speak to yourself that maybe you don't want. For example, I'm terrible with directions. I'm not a night person. I'm always late. I hate reading. So these could be internal mantras that we have. So take a minute, think about one that you have that you don't necessarily like. Okay. When we repeat a story to ourselves over and over again, eventually it becomes our identity and it shapes what we do and how we act. If you believe that you hate reading, whether it's an article or a book or a long post on social media, you choose to avoid reading at all costs because you've told yourself over and over again you hate reading. But if you flip your internal identity to saying that you are a reader and then you prove it to yourself, right? So you've got to say the mantra, I love reading, and then you prove it to yourself. And that can be by just reading one paragraph a day or one page a day. But eventually, as you begin to practice what you're telling yourself, you also believe it. And the more evidence you have for that belief, the more you practice reading, the stronger you'll believe that you're a reader. Until one day you wake up and you realize you identify as a reader, and suddenly your goal, right? Maybe that goal was to read a book a year. You don't even need that goal anymore because your identity is a reader and you already read regularly. So, any thoughts on this slide and the different processes of change? It is empowering, Nancy. I agree. I think when we realize that we get to write our own story, we get to decide who we are and who we want to be. We take some of that power away that we've given our bad habits, right? We can change those. Cindy says it really puts into perspective mind over matter. Yeah. And Jessica adds to that and says, and it's not fixed, right? The habits we've created and things, we can change those. Just the way we created them, we can also change them. It does take some work and effort, but yeah, it's not fixed. And Vicky says that small steps make sense. I agree. Lauren says a reflection that encourages me to reframe my internal voice and motivations. I agree. I think when I read this section of the book, it made me realize that what we say to ourselves matters more than we give it credit for, right? The way that we talk to ourselves, that internal voice, our internal dialogue, has the ability to help us become who we want to be. Okay. So next, we are going to be talking about the 4 stages of habits. So James Clear, in his book, he breaks down habits into 4 specifics. So the first one is cue. Cue is what triggers our behavior. The second is cravings. Cravings are the motivational force behind the habit. So this is what causes us to react. Response is the action we take in response to the craving. So this is the habit itself. And then reward is the pleasurable experience that the activity achieves, right? So rewards are the end of the goal of every habit. The cue is about noticing the reward. The craving is about wanting the reward. The response is obtaining the reward. And so according to James Clear, we chase rewards for two purposes. Either it's to satisfy us or it's because they teach us. But either way, we're trying to constantly be gaining that rewards. And so habits are simply reliable solutions to the reoccurring problems in our environment. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this. So he breaks down the habit loop into two sections, right? So you have the problem phase, those are your cue and your cravings, and then you have your solution phase, the response and the reward. And so the 4 stages can be thought of as a loop, right? And as you move through the problem phase, your cue and cravings, your response is your solution phase. So let me give you an example. I have a little Starbucks addiction. I hope that maybe some of you can identify with that a little bit. But for example, so my cue is that when I drive to work, I pass a Starbucks every single day. And especially, I'm one of those people that I am not a morning person. I should reframe how I talk to myself. So maybe I will be a morning person. But I drive with my windows down the first little bit that I get in the car to wake myself up. And so then I drive by that Starbucks every morning with my windows down, and I can smell that wonderful coffee house aroma. And that smell triggers a craving, right? So the cue is getting in my car driving to work. The smell of the coffee house triggers my craving, and that creates a problem for me. And now all I can think about is how much happier I would be if I just had a, hot cup of caffeine in my hand. And so my response is the solution, right? So I go through the drive-through and I buy myself a drink. My reward is that caffeine buzz. My problem has now seen a solution, and I have reinforced my habit. I've created this loop where driving to work automatically becomes associated with getting to Starbucks. And so I now adjust my life to make sure that I need that extra 10 minutes, right? So that I can go through Starbucks and not be late. I adjust my budget, or maybe you don't adjust your budget and you pay for it later so that you can buy the $3 or $4 drink. So that's an example from me of that habit loop that I've created. So take a minute. I want you to think of a habit loop that you've created, and maybe think of one that you would love to disrupt or create. Kyle says stage 4 has an Epicurean vibe to it. Brittany says, I agree. That's why this habit formation loop is so effective. Sean says he's got a chocolate craving. I'm with you. I feel that. I made chocolate sourdough bread this morning. It was to die for. In case anyone wants some, shoot me a message. I can make you some. Okay, so once again, we're trying to think of habit loops that we already have in place, or maybe a habit loop that you would like to create. And if you just keep that in your mind, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Matthew says, create a habit of exercising. Emmy has a habit of looking at my phone when I'm bored instead of doing something productive. Perfect. These are all great examples of habit loops. So throughout this week and next week, what we're going to talk about are these laws and how they can help us create and break habits. So thinking of that habit loop, how we create a good habit for the first one, right? For Q is we're going to make it obvious. If we want to get rid of our habit, then we need to make it invisible. We need to make the cue invisible. The second law is craving. So we're going to look at either making it attractive or making it unattractive. The third law is response. So making it easy or making it difficult. And then the third or fourth law is reward. So making it satisfying or making it unsatisfying. So keep those habits that you like to create or the habits you'd like to break in your mind. I actually recommend writing them down so that you can remember the thing that you want to work on as we go throughout this workshop. Okay, so the first one, make it obvious. Hit the next slide. What? Next slide. Perfect. Okay, making it obvious. So the first step when it comes to behavior change is awareness, right? We have to know we have a problem if we want to change the problem. So he recommends 2 different ways, and we're going to talk about them in depth to bring to mind first the habits we already have. So the first one is called the habit scorecard, and the second one is pointing and calling. So the habit scorecard, I will show you what it looks like on the next slide. This is what it looks like, and it's literally just a list of your habits. Let me throw it in the chat real quick. Okay, so if you click on that link, it'll also just take you to the PDF version that you're welcome to download. But the habit scorecard is a method that allows you to become more self-aware and notice your habits and behaviors that you may normally overlook. So the recommendation is for this to be as comprehensive of a list as you can think of. We're creatures of habits and routines. Often we do things we don't even recognize our habits because they're so ingrained into our norm. So, for example, you get out of bed, you go to the bathroom, you wash your face, you brush your teeth. Each one of those actions is a habit, right? It's something that we naturally do and are ingrained in ourselves. So I want you to take the next 30 seconds. Obviously, 30 seconds is not long enough to create a comprehensive list, but I want you to either think or write down some of those habits in our lives. And then as you write them down, you can rate them. So you can put just a plus sign or a negative sign or a neutral sign. And that's how you're going to rate and identify your habits. And the goal with identifying whether they're positive, negative, or neutral is so that you can better understand what maybe needs to change, what you want to add, or what you want to get rid of. So take 30 seconds. Sean's first habit of the day is to hit the snooze button. Heather asked the question, is the score my perception of my habits or society's perception? Great question. It's your perception, because ultimately the only thing that matters is what you think of the action. So if you rate it as great, great, put a positive. If you want to get rid of it or you don't really care about it, put it as negative or neutral. What matters is how you perceive what you're doing each day. I guess the caveat to that is unless you have a habit that's breaking the law, then please mark that as a negative habit. We don't want to promote any breaking the law. Kelly says, my habit is to check my phone first thing when I wake up. I think a lot of us probably have that habit. Heather says, that's funny, Sean, I have the same problem, but I wrote staying up too late.
That's a good perception.
Yeah. That's a great way to reframe that mind, Heather, too, right? So Sean's hits the snooze button. You're recognizing that that habit starts earlier. It starts by going to bed too late. So that's great. That's a great way to think of it. Okay, The next thing we're going to talk about is pointing and calling. So sometimes we have the struggle of when we're going through this habit scorecard of knowing what we should be pointing out in our lives as a habit or a bad habit. And the next slide is actually a video that talks about this technique called pointing and calling that was originally developed in Japan for their train system. So we're going to watch this short video about it.
On every platform and every train.
And God's Holy Spirit spoke through his chosen messengers. God therefore speaks to us through the scripture.
On every platform and every train in Tokyo, employees in white gloves are always pointing at things. These almost ritualistic gestures might look a bit silly, but they're crucial to keeping Japan's massive train network running smoothly, and they might even save lives. Tokyo operates one of the most advanced train networks in the world, carrying upward of 13 billion passenger trips each year. And with hundreds of trains entering and leaving stations each day, station attendants need to be vigilant. To ensure smooth, safe rail operations, they use a technique called shisakanko, also known as pointing and calling. Attendants point at anything that could be a hazard, from making sure the track is clear of debris before trains arrive, to confirming timetables and making sure gauges and instruments are in order. But does all this extra gesturing actually do anything? How does it work? Studies have shown that pointing to an object and verbalizing your intended action increases attention and awareness, making it harder to mess up. A landmark study by the Japan Railway Technical Research Institute found that employing the combination of pointing and calling reduced errors by 85%. Daito Suzuki and Yohei Sato are experts in pointing and calling, and they should be. Their company makes safety simulators, some of which are designed specifically for practicing the technique.
The ratio of mistake without confirmation method is 2.5%. But applying point and calling procedure, so it can reduce 0.4%.
With 140 buttons laid out on a grid, workers follow the on-screen coordinates and push the correct button. Get it right and get a chime, get it wrong or take too long, and Suzuki and Sato say these machines are necessary because a lot of people in Japan, well, don't see the point in pointing and calling. Sato says there are three main reasons people don't like shisakanko.
恥ずかしい、めんどくさい、上司がやらない。上司がやる。
And of course, people just feel like it's extra work.
やった方が楽じゃないですか。実は楽ですよ。っていうと皆さん、あ、楽な手段だったらいいよね。ということを教えているのが僕らの研修センターなんですね。
Pointing and calling isn't only used in Tokyo, and it's not just used on trains. Amidst the constant frenzy of activity at Ishigaki Airport in Okinawa, workers of all stripes can be observed using shisakanko. We even caught Mr. Sato and Suzuki dutifully confirming traffic was clear with a quick point. The practice really doesn't need to be limited to white-gloved professionals. We've all been there. Where are my keys? Did I remember to lock my car? So the next time you leave the house, take a cue from Japan's massive rail network and give pointing and calling a try.
Okay, so pointing and calling is a great way for us to recognize our habits. It's also a great way to help us create better habits, right? So for example, you go to the grocery store, right? And you only need apples, bananas, milk, and yogurt at the grocery store. So you can say as you're walking out the door, right, out loud, I only need to get apples, bananas, milk, and yogurt at the grocery store. Even though you may feel silly walking out your door saying it, Chances are by saying it out loud, you're going to hold yourself a little bit more responsible. So when you walk through the grocery store and all of a sudden you see the strawberries are on sale and oh, those raspberries look really good. And look, the broccoli's on sale. Because you said it out loud, you have a higher chance of just getting the things you need, your apples, bananas, milk, and yogurt. So the quote from this chapter is that hearing your bad habits spoken aloud makes the consequence seem more real. It adds weight to the action rather than letting yourself mindlessly slip into an old routine. The process of behavior change always starts with awareness. So think back to those habits that we just thought about. And I want you to pick one or two bad habits that you have, and I want you to say it out loud. You don't need to unmute yourself. This can just be a private exercise, but say either out loud if you're in a private setting, or you can speak it in your mind or write it down. But one or two things that you do. Now, the practice of this is that you're taking responsibility for that action. So with the example of speaking out your grocery list, right? Another example of that is going through that grocery store and saying when you're not completing that list, right? So I'm picking up the cereal and putting it in my cart, even though we have cereal at home and it's not in our budget this week. By saying it out loud and doing the action, you're putting more weight to that action. And chances are you might either pick that cereal back up out of your cart and put it back on the shelf, or you're going to take responsibility for the action and recognize that it's not in your budget and now it needs to be adjusted. So pointing and calling is a good way to start cutting out unwanted habits or actions in our lives. I want to go through the comment section here. Let's see. So Kelly says it makes sense. Makes sense that you use better something to remember something. Yep. Jay says, like the old age adage of writing down your goals. Kimberly says the hardest thing is to be aware. It is, which is why it's so important that we are pointing out and writing down all of our habits, good and bad. Brittany says some habits almost become like background noise because we've done them for so long, so we don't even notice them. And we talk as we go on about those cues, right? And so sometimes we have these habits simply because our environment is set up for them. Kyle says, as someone diagnosed with ADHD, engaging the senses is essential to my everyday functioning. Maureen, this reminds me of the idea of practicing a choice or action before it happens so that your brain already has the pathway to follow and make it easier for ourselves. Yes. Okay. We're going to stop there because I want to talk about that because that's what is on this next slide. We call it here implementation intention. So the best way to start a new habit is by creating these I will statements. So I will pick an action. So for example, I will meditate at, and then you're going to pick a time. I will meditate at 7 a.m. and then where? In my kitchen. Another example is I will tell my partner one thing I love about them at 9:30 p.m. in bed. Another one could be I will put out my movement clothes for tomorrow at 9:15 p.m. in my room. So this is just a really great way for us to become more responsible. I have a note to read a quote from the book, but I'm trying to remember which one it is. No, I have it right here. Okay, I'm going to read this because it is a good one. So in 2001, researchers in Great Britain began working with 248 people to build better exercise habits over the course of 2 weeks. The subjects were divided into 3 groups. The first was a control group, and they were asked to track how often they exercised. The second was the motivation group. They were asked not only to track their or their workouts, but also to read some material on the benefits of exercise. The researchers explained to the group how exercise could reduce the risk of coronary heart disease and improve heart health. Then the third group. This group received the same presentation as the second group, which ensured they all had equal levels of motivation. However, they were also asked to formulate a plan for when and where they would exercise over the following week. Specifically, each member of the third group completed the sentence, "During the next week, I will partake in at least 20 minutes of vigorous exercise on blank day at blank time in blank place." In the first and second groups, 35 to 38% of people exercised at least once a week. Interestingly, the motivational presentation given to the second group seemed to have no meaningful impact on behavior, but 91% of the third group exercised at least once a week, more than double the normal rate. The sentence they filled out is what researchers refer to as implementation intention, which is the plan you see on the screen. So what that experiment shows is that when we write down, not just say it, not just speak it, but when we write down our intention for a new habit, we are over 2/3 more likely to complete it than someone who has not. So if everyone will take just a quick second, even take a snapshot on your phone of this, I want you to think of a way, whether that be right now or something in the future, of a new intention that you have. Okay, you'll move on to the next slide. So here are the examples that I gave you. So I will meditate for 1 minute at 7 a.m. I'll tell my partner one thing I love them at 9:30 p.m. in bed, and I will put out my movement clothes for tomorrow at 9:15 p.m. in my room. The second step to starting a new habit is called habit stacking. Habit stacking is when you take a habit you already have and let the response or reward of that habit be the cue for the habit you would like to create. The key is tying your desired behavior into something you already do. So, for example, I'm trying to remember if I put it on the next slide or not. I did. Okay, so on the next slide, I gave you the example. So sticking with the 3 I gave you, after I pour my cup of coffee each morning, I will meditate for 1 minute, right? And that coincides with my intention to meditate for 1 minute in my kitchen. The next example would be after I get into bed at night, I will tell my partner one thing I love about them. And that goes along with that. I will tell my partner one thing I love about them at 9:30 p.m. in bed, right? The cue is you get into bed every single night. And then the third one, after I wash my face for the night, right? That's the habit I already have established. I will lay out my movement clothes for the next day. So there's the new habit. So the most important thing when we talk about habit stacking is to remember we don't want to ask ourselves to start a new habit when you're likely already doing something else at that time. So this is why the habit scorecard is really important, because you need to have that comprehensive list of all your habits you already have during the day. That way, when you're trying to add in a habit, you know where you have time in your day to complete them. So any thoughts on those 2 steps? Brittany says it works. I can hear her here in the office. Kyle says the steps echo rituals found in many religious groups. Catherine says, I didn't realize I was spending time doing each day was really a bad habit. And then Brittany says, calling and pointing has some serious power to do. It does. We're going to skip the next slide because I want to be mindful of your time. But this is a great video that just talks about why environment matters. And a study that was done in the Boston UMass Hospital. So I can send that out via email if you guys are interested. Oh, yes. And it'll be posted on our Healthy Lifestyles page. So we'll have access to that. So environment. So the step 3 of creating a new habit change is learning that your environment matters more. Your habits change depending on the room you are in and the cues in front of you. Environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior. Many of the actions we take each day are shaped not by purposeful drive or choice, but by the most obvious option. And so when we look at environment, it's important to remember that every habit is initiated by a cue. And if we can make our cues stand out and easy to see, we're more likely to have the habits we want. So let's talk about that in relation to the examples I've been giving. If our goal is to meditate in the kitchen, then keep a meditation prompt next to the coffee pot. Remember, the goal is to establish a 1-minute meditation after you pour a cup of coffee. For the second one, keeping a sign that says, I love you on your bedside table, so that as you climb into bed every night, you see it, which can then spark that conversation to tell your significant other what you love about them. Putting your movement clothes on the bathroom counter so that you see them first thing when you wake up and go to the bathroom, right? So not only are we washing our face and then pulling out our movement clothes, we're going to put them on the counter so that that habit that we already have to get up and wash our face, we see our movement clothes in the mornings. So think about what you wrote down, about what habit you want and how can you fit your environment to those goals. The most important thing to remember is that motivation is overrated. We're going to talk about a quote on the next slide about that. So the secret to self-control. The people with the best self-control are typically the ones who need to use it the least. It's easier to practice self-restraint when you don't have to use it very often. So yes, perseverance, grit, and willpower are essential to success. But the way to improve these qualities is not by wishing you were a more disciplined person, but by creating a more disciplined environment. And so this is the idea that we are going to end on. The hardest thing is that once a habit has been created, we're unlikely to forget it. So while we can we can break a bad habit, you'll have to cut bad habits out at the source, meaning you need to reduce the exposure to the cue, right? The first law of behavior change. So you'll need to reduce that exposure to the cue that causes that habit. For example, going back to the beginning with my Starbucks addiction, the single best way for me to get rid of the habit is to take a different route to work, right? If I don't ever drive by the Starbucks, my triggers, my desire for that Starbucks will slowly fade. So remember, when we remove the cue, the chances are that the entire habit will either fade or end. That's the secret of self-control. It's not having the willpower for me to drive by the Starbucks every day. It's disciplining my environment so that I don't even see the Starbucks, which then allows me to make my bad habit invisible and then to create good habits. So last slide is just that reminder to make the cue obvious, and for the bad habits, make it invisible. Any last thoughts? I want to be mindful of your time. I know we only have 3 minutes and I moved through those last slides pretty quick, but any thoughts or experiences you've had with this first law, making the cue obvious or making it invisible? Heather says, environment seems key when you have several habits you are trying to break or form. Even if they are small, trying to change several habits can be overwhelming. Yes. And that's why we want just that 1% change. In the book, he talks a lot about just 2-minute forms, right? So if you want to meditate and you want to be better at meditating, we're not starting out with a 5 or a 10 or 15-minute meditation every day. We're starting out with 1 minute after we pour ourselves a cup of coffee every morning, right? That cup of coffee is too hot to drink anyways. So let's take 1 minute while it cools to meditate. So it's creating a small behavior change that can then create a larger habit. Sean says to hide the chocolate. Yeah, don't make it obvious if you can't see it. Leslie says it's so much easier to not eat sweets when they are in the house. Catherine says, put my exercise clothes for the next day out on the bathroom counter the night before. Yep, that's a great example.
I also think that this when you think of several habits, trying to change several habits can be overwhelming. It definitely can, unless you use the habit stacking. So doing and changing things that you're already doing, right? Habit stacking is you're just adding a small step to something that you're already doing. Just like Kirsten's been using this whole time is you want that morning coffee and you also want to meditate. You're already getting your morning coffee, and while it's cooling, again, you meditate that time. So maybe changing that perspective and adding to things that you're already doing rather than taking that perspective of, oh my gosh, I'm trying to change 18 things. This is so overwhelming because it totally can be, and that part's discouraging.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. I totally agree. I think that it's easier when we habit stack. Emmy, you did ask if it's possible to get a copy of this workshop. Yes. So this is recorded. We'll put it out on our website so anyone can go in and watch it. And it will be available by the end of the day. And then next time, so if you're able to make it next week, same time, Tuesday from 12 to 1, we are going to discuss those last 3 laws. So we'll discuss laws 2, 3, and 4, and how we can continue to build and break habits. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have any questions, let us know. And don't forget to sign in so you can get your points.
Thank you.
Catherine, if you scroll up just a tiny bit, you'll see that sign in. Oh, and Brittany just threw it in again too. Thank you.